had considered making a follow-up episode of this series for a while, but I just couldn't find the time. Well, it's fair to say I've not got much else to do now. I can't just vibe in solitude. Overall, I'm pretty proud of this series, but it's been a while, so I have a few corrections and clarifications to make. I called this a rough guide for a reason, because while I hope it's not arrogant to say that I do know a lot about this, I can't know everything, and I'm always learning. I'm more than willing to own up to mistakes and expand on my knowledge. Bear in mind, the point of this is to give you the basics on a broad range of subgenres. I like and listen to pretty much all of them, but there's a lot of people who'll just find one or two that they really love and mostly stick to those, and those are the people you should talk to for more in-depth information. You'll find them in the comments calling me a poser. So now that I'm doing some follow-up episodes, I'll talk a bit more about some variations of black metal that I missed out before, and explain a little bit about hardcore punk and the various waves of metalcore. But first of all, I have quite a lot of corrections and clarifications to make. This might take up a whole episode. Let's start with the most glaring, which is my little table of primary subgenres. I said there are 6 initially, but in reality I now think there are 7. Power metal absolutely is its own category. I'm not sure what exactly I was thinking back then. I guess I considered it to be sort of within the extended family of thrash, but it's really not. So here's an updated primary subgenre table, and I finally fixed the bit at the top. I said that every metal band falls under at least one of these. Just to clarify, I consider glam metal to be a variation of old school heavy metal, and I don't think it can be categorised into any of the broad subgenres. I said that the new wave of British heavy metal resembled a subgenre, and that this was the first major metal scene with a lot of bands going for a similar sound. The subgenre in question is just heavy metal, and the new wave of British heavy metal is not a distinct sound to me. If anything, it's just a greater refinement of heavy metal. I said that Ghost are like a revival of heavy metal, but having listened to a bit more of them, I do still think they'll be a good starting point, but I don't think they're really metal. They're probably more like hard rock, or maybe glam rock, or, let's be real, pop rock. Half of it sounds like satanic ABBA to me, and honestly, I think that was probably their intention. I mean, respect to them, they certainly have a unique sound. That being said, in general, I have a fairly inclusive standard for metal, and I include a lot of stuff that some people wouldn't count. The variety is one of the things that I appreciate about metal, and I prefer to keep an open mind. If you yourself happen to have a stricter standard for what counts as metal, that's totally fine, but just keep in mind my standard's a bit different to most people. It's hard to determine what the first subgenre was, but I think since Black Sabbath can be described as doom metal, doom is technically the first, so I'll stand by that statement. I listed Typo Negative as a doom metal band, which I probably shouldn't have. I think they certainly have a lot of elements of doom in their sound, and are often the band that gets people interested in doom, but they certainly aren't a textbook example of the subgenre. In fact, it might be a stretch to even call them metal. But like I've said, I have a broad definition. If they're hard rock, then they're a particularly slow and dark kind of hard rock that's pretty close to doom metal. They were very popular in the 90s, and they're probably the most well-known doom-adjacent band other than Black Sabbath, so they're worth noting. But if you're looking for a solid example of the doom metal sound, they're not quite that. Just pretend I said Bell Witch and check them out. I joked about recording black metal on an Xbox headset, but it's worth noting that the vocals on Burzum's Philosophem were recorded with the headset from a helicopter to sound as bad as possible. I'll admit, I do enjoy bad production sometimes, but it has to be bad in the right way, and there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to whether production works for me. As a general rule, if it sounds bad in a way that makes it louder and more piercing, then I like it. If it sounds bad in a way that makes the overall sound underwhelming and muted, I can't get into it as much. Bad production is really a high risk, high reward approach. When it works, it's great, but it's safer to just have good production. I should note that blast beats are just as common and just as important to the sound in black metal as they are in death metal. Sometimes the blast beats are slower in black metal, but I worry that I gave the impression that they aren't as important to black metal as they are to death metal. No, they are. They absolutely are. I pointed out that Gorgoroth is a Lord of the Rings reference, but actually, so is Burzum. In fact, a lot of black metal band names and album names, song names, all sorts of stuff comes from Tolkien. The reason for this is that Lord of the Rings is full of cool names, and most dudes in black metal bands are massive nerds. Hey, I'm not judging, I am too, I'm just saying. I said that double bass drums are almost mandatory in metal, but that's not technically true. It's often cheaper and easier to have one bass drum with a double kick pedal, allowing the drummer to use both feet on the one drum to create the same sort of sound. Just a small nitpick there. While talking about the Bay Area thrash scene, I said East Coast when I meant to say West Coast. At least I showed the right one on screen. So weirdly, when I first wrote and recorded this, I said East Coast and West Coast, I got them mixed up and said the wrong ones, and I only noticed and fixed one of them. So I said East Coast twice. I said Slayer are pretty much as heavy as thrash gets, and while they're certainly the heaviest of the big four, and were arguably the heaviest when they first started, there have since been heavier thrash bands such as Dark Angel, Possessed, and Demolition Hammer. While talking about the musicianship of thrash, I decided I would play a song that's particularly technical and difficult, and for whatever reason I played Chemical Warfare by Slayer, the main riff, because I always assumed that was way harder than it actually is. Turns out it's not. As soon as you learn how to tremolo pick, it's really easy. It's so easy, I can do it, and I fucking suck at guitar. There are countless technical guitar solos I could have put there, but from the sheer speed of that riff, I always assumed it was a lot harder to play than it actually is. So while I do still stand by what I was saying, that was a really bad example. I said I wouldn't show the Dawn of the Black Hearts album cover, but I failed to notice it on a patch in one of the Battle Vest pictures I used. Sorry if I traumatized anyone, but chances are you've probably all seen it by now. Now, I was correct when I said the "you are a false" quote comes from the Brazilian black and thrash scene, but I'm not sure why I didn't say the band, because they are worth talking about. They're called Sarcophago, and the song is death thrash. That band has kind of become a symbol of semi-ironic gatekeeping online. Sarcophago are quite obscure, but they had a very important influence on both death metal and black metal. Turns out, Gloryhammer aren't from Scotland. Chris Bowes is the only Scottish member, but the band itself seems to be a power metal United Nations. I just assumed that the band with a singer with the name Angus McFife, who sings about the unicorn invasion of Dundee, would have to be from here. But I guess not. Now, I have no idea why I pronounced Chuck Schuldinger's name with a G. It's not Chuck Schuldinger, it's Chuck Schuldiner. One of the most influential musicians in metal history, and I can't even say his name right. Speaking of death, while I did acknowledge that Possessed helped to create the name death metal, I didn't really acknowledge the fact that a lot of people argue they invented the sound as well. Now, I definitely acknowledge that the vocals were hugely influential, but I would disagree. I don't think Possessed are a death metal band. They sound more like raw, more aggressive thrash metal with harsh vocals, but they just aren't quite death metal to me. This is just my opinion, but I would say that Scream Bloody Gore is the first album that had a real, proper death metal sound to it. That's where I would draw the line. When describing blast beats, I missed out one component. Blast beats are when you hit the snare, a cymbal, and the bass drum. Much like Metallica recording And Justice for All, I missed out the bass. While talking about black metal pioneering blast beats, I used a picture of Fenriz with his cat because it's cute. But Darkthrone were the second wave of black metal, and it was the first wave that pioneered blast beats. The second wave of black metal was partly a reaction to death metal, which is an aspect of it that I overlooked, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. When I listed examples of death metal bands, I said Florida death metal pretty much as a force of habit, but not all of those bands were from Florida or even in the Florida scene. For example, Suffocation were from New York, which had its own death metal scene. It's just a small mistake, but if you're not from Florida, you probably don't want people to think you are. I also should have explained that Morbid Angel were pioneers of the genre and arguably had just as big an influence as Death did. I kind of listed them among the others as just another name in the pile, but it's worth highlighting them as being particularly important. Also, another weird note about Morbid Angel, they look like a glam metal band. I don't know why. I shouted out In Flames as a Swedish death metal band, but they're more melodeath. A better example of straightforward Swedish death metal would have been Carnage. While I was correct in my assertion that Amon Amarth are the best known Viking themed metal band, most Viking metal sounds very different to them. Viking metal bands tend to take their inspiration from Bathory, particularly their album Bloodfire Death. Yeah, you're hearing this right, Quorthon managed to invent 2 subgenres with one band. When discussing slam metal, I was listing some of the bands and I did mention Devourment, but I should have given a lot more credit to them, because they essentially invented it. Devourment are also generally more respected by the death metal community than most slam bands, and that's mostly due to them having a degree of creativity and originality, when a lot of slam is criticised for being kinda cookie cutter. I mean, it's essentially an entire subgenre based around plagiarising one Suffocation riff from 1991. Now, while I was correct that grindcore did have a strong underground scene in England, there were scenes all over the world. Bands like Repulsion and Terrorizer were particularly important in the US scene, and had just as much influence over international bands as Napalm Death did. I do still think of grindcore as a form of death metal, but some people draw a distinction between them. I've always thought of it as death metal with a strong hardcore punk influence, but others argue that it's hardcore punk with a strong death metal influence. It comes between the two, with some bands leaning more in one direction than the other. So effectively, grindcore can be thought of as both hardcore punk and metal. I should have clarified that the death metal thing is my own interpretation, so don't take that as fact. I would consider a lot of grindcore to be under the broader death metal category, but it's definitely its own scene, with some very distinctive features. The short songs, the riff style, the political lyrics, the messiness, and the noise. It's obviously not the same as old school death metal, but I think it has enough death metal DNA to be a part of the same family tree, while simultaneously having its own place in hardcore. I certainly consider grindcore to be a part of metal as a whole, and it's hugely important in the history of metal, whether you count it or not. Plus, fans of grindcore are usually also fans of death metal and vice versa because of the commonalities. There's a lot of crossover in the fan bases. Gore grind isn't just a lyrical difference. I suggested that it was, but I forgot to mention that it usually uses pitch shifted vocals to make them even lower, and usually a lot of downtuning as well. So there is some change in sound from regular grindcore to gore grind. It's not a huge difference, but I thought I should point it out. Also, gore grind is even closer to death metal than regular grindcore, but not as close as death grind, which has the speed of grindcore with the technicality and longer songs of death metal. And I'm so fucking tired. What does any of this mean anymore? While explaining what happened to Dimebag Darrell, I feel I oversimplified it a bit. Like, oh, that dude had PTSD. That explains it. You know what they're like. No, obviously there's more to it than that. I just wanted to clarify that there wasn't a grander motivation behind it. I mean, after talking about the second wave black metal scene, I didn't want people thinking that the dude from Trapped organised an assassination or something. But I do worry that I was a little bit insensitive about mental health issues there. Mental illness is neither necessary nor sufficient for someone to be a killer. Listen up, Snowflake. If you were were offended by that, I apologise, and I'll try to be more considerate next time. Perhaps I should have clarified that nu metal isn't actually considered to be real metal by a lot of people. Personally, I do think it counts. I mean, just because you don't like it, that doesn't change the fact that it's too heavy to just be hard rock. It's incredibly commercialised, watered down metal, but I still think it counts. If I piss in a glass and then dilute it with a lot of water, you're still not going to drink it, because while it might not be pure piss, it's close enough. Now, please keep in mind, I also think glam metal counts, so take this with a pinch of salt. Now, I understand that just because it has metal in the name, that doesn't mean that it actually is metal. I mean, a urinal cake may be called a cake, but I'm not going to take a bite out of one. But if it looks like metal, and sounds like metal, it is metal, in my opinion. To me, with the right kind of guitar tone and style of riffs, I'll consider something to be metal. I don't have a very high standard, but I feel like I know it when I hear it. Also, if anyone tries to definitively tell you what is and isn't metal as though something this ill-defined and subjective is a matter of fact, they're probably a fucking idiot. ABBA obviously aren't metal, you can say that with certainty, but when it comes to bands on the border of metal, it's a lot more complicated. So have some patience when people disagree with you. I would also like to point out that nu metal is often used by people who don't listen to metal to refer to basically any early 2000s music with distorted guitars. But bands like Evanescence, Puddle of Mudd and Trapped are really just radio rock. They're not heavy enough to be nu metal, and that's a pretty low bar. Plus, a lot of bands that comfortably are nu metal have a lot of individual songs that themselves are too soft to be nu metal. So, if someone tells me that nu metal isn't actually metal and they're referring to stuff like this, I actually agree. I get where you're coming from there. I would argue, however, that stuff like this is metal. Again, that's just my opinion. I said that Rage Against the Machine aren't quite metal. Honestly, I find it very difficult to know where to stand on them. I kind of flip-flop between the two positions. They really do blur the line. I definitely think they have a lot of commonalities with metal, but just in terms of the guitar tone, the riff style, something about it just intuitively, in a way I can't explain, sounds closer to rock to me. So I feel like rock is a better fitting term for them. But it's certainly hard rock, and it's certainly as heavy as rock gets without becoming metal, I would say. I said that Gojira are progressive death metal, and while their early albums are a bit closer to regular death metal, their current sound is very unique and sounds very little like death metal to me. Oh sure, they have a lot of the essential elements such as harsh vocals, fast drumming, heavy guitars, but I would never cite them as an example of death metal. I think progressive death metal sort of fits as a description, and I can also understand why some people call them technical death metal. They do fit in a very abstract sense, but I don't really associate them with death metal as a whole. I think it's probably safe to categorise them more broadly as progressive metal. I wasn't sure what to call Strapping Young Lad, and so I called them extreme thrash. But upon reflection, I think they fit much more comfortably under industrial metal. As it turns out, some people do know what else to call the Dillinger Escape Plan. They're sometimes referred to as math rock for their precisely timed rhythms. Tool are another one that some don't consider to be metal. This happens a lot with prog bands. I still think they count, but they are really teetering on the edge, so I understand if you don't count them. Now, some of you might be thinking, isn't gent a made-up subgenre? And to that I say, they're all made up. A subgenre's legitimacy is just the use of the name over time. That's hard science right there. Maybe in another decade or so we'll look back on gent as just being a funny name for progressive metalcore. For now, I still think it's a different sound purely because Meshuggah were doing it before metalcore took off. I said that Tesseract exclusively use clean vocals, but they do occasionally use harsh vocals, as it turns out. Lesson here, don't assume stuff after only listening to a couple of songs. I didn't notice any glaring mistakes in the metalcore section, instead it's more of what I omitted. I will say Avenged Sevenfold probably aren't the best example of metalcore. Once they went mainstream they essentially became radio rock, so not a good example. I should also have clarified that screamo is a subgenre of emo music, which doesn't really have anything to do with metal. Basically, it was regular emo music, but they screamed the vocals for more emotional intensity. Since a lot of metalcore bands have emo haircuts and a shitload of metalcore fans used to be into My Chemical Romance, it's no surprise that screamo was used to refer to metalcore as well. Unfortunately, because it's a memorable phrase, it is now normie shorthand for literally any heavy music with harsh vocals. For some reason, I said breakdowns started in metalcore, but they obviously started in hardcore. I suppose metalcore is when breakdowns were regularly introduced to metal, but even then, you can find sections of old school death metal songs which resemble a sort of breakdown. It's really not that far off. I made a joke where I implied that Billie Eilish can't play any instruments. I have literally no idea if she can play any instruments. The internet happened to be on a bit of a Billie Eilish circle jerk at the time, so I got sassy and threw that in there without checking. And I still haven't checked. Because I don't care. I'm sure she's a perfectly talented artist and her music clearly speaks to a lot of people. I'm not one of those people, but you lot have fun. Also, I need to take a massive fucking L for using a picture from Lords of Chaos without realising it. I was rushing a little bit towards the end and couldn't tell in the wee preview window on Sony Vegas. Look, I'm sorry. Please don't stab me. Now, I was correct in my assertion that the core modifier usually suggests something to do with metalcore, but realistically you can only safely assume that it refers to a hardcore influence of some description. I mentioned that the nationality of a band doesn't actually affect the sound, and this is true for the most part, but different scenes around the world do have certain commonalities. It's sort of like regional variants of food. It's not like you can't get a thin crust pizza in Chicago, but if someone refers to Chicago style pizza, they're probably talking about deep dish. I should clarify that while some people do, I don't consider lyrical and thematic tropes to be sufficient for a subgenre. To me, the distinctions between subgenres are about the sound and the music. For example, Ailstorm and Swashbuckle are both pirate metal, because that's entirely measured by what the lyrics are about, but they sound nothing like each other. Ailstorm are a mix of folk and power metal, while Swashbuckle are death metal.
We're sending down to the depths below. Make that bastard walk the plank with a bottle of rum and a yo-ho-ho. Dirty man's novice. We're always full of valuables. We shut away to the one day.
Now, I will still refer to pirate metal sometimes because it's perfectly fine as a jokey thing that they have in common, but it's not what I would consider to be a subgenre. With that said, depressive suicidal black metal is not a joke subgenre. I mean, it's not exactly known for its humour, is it? I never meant to suggest that it was a joke name. I was just talking about that it was only a lyrical difference, so it's not really a separate category. But it turns out I was wrong about that too. There are actual musical differences between it and regular black metal. It has a far more melancholic sound and was hugely influenced by Darkthrone's Transylvanian Hunger album. It's more of a micro-genre, but as I said, there's more to it than just its lyrics and themes. I highlighted Cattle Decapitation as vegan metal. That's not true. They are vegetarians, but they're not vegan. Also, I don't think kawaii metal is a joke subgenre. It sounds like a joke subgenre, and it is really daft, but it's definitely a different sound. It's not a lyrical thing. There's quite clearly a musical difference with the whole J-pop fusion. Plus, at this point, there's an entire industry behind it. And much like K-pop, it's creepy as fuck. So, with all those corrections and clarifications out of the way, believe it or not, there is some stuff I missed. And we're going to take a look at that in the next episode. Firstly, let's talk a bit more about black metal. I took the approach of discussing the subgenres in the order that they appeared, and the first wave of black metal did come before death metal, but I didn't talk about how the second wave was in part a response to death metal. Death metal took some of the motifs of first wave black metal, such as blast beats, but ignored a lot of the atmosphere and theatrics. It mostly focused on taking the speed and aggression of thrash and making it even more intense. For a while, this was the status quo for the extreme side of metal: technical, fast, and heavy. But not everyone was satisfied with this direction, especially not the Norwegians.
We wanted to continue the primitive sound that bands like Battery and Celtic Frost, because thrash metal had toned down, became more straight. Death metal, on the other hand, became more technical. I saw what Chuck did with death and I was going, fucking hell, it sucks. Sorry to say.
Euronymous in particular really resented the fact that death metal bands were playing this brutal music while dressed in t-shirts and cargo shorts. The second wave of black metal was very much a response to death metal, taking the simpler, more raw sound of the first wave of black metal and focusing on a sense of atmosphere that was largely lost in death metal. Death metal is all about those brutal, head-banging riffs that get you in the mood to mosh, whereas black metal is often droning, discordant, and repetitive. This isn't to say that black metal isn't enjoyable to listen to. There's plenty of songs with riffs that give me a similar feeling to death metal, and I do find myself headbanging to A Blaze in the Northern Sky, but black metal wasn't just about evoking the visceral catharsis of death metal, and could instead evoke fear, dread, hopelessness, and many other emotions that don't exactly put you in a bopping mood. Let's compare something like Leprosy by Death to Transylvanian Hunger by Darkthrone. Additionally, the aforementioned cargo shorts were an affront to metal in the eyes of Euronymous, who appreciated the importance of the aesthetic. This is why corpse paint and spikes became almost mandatory for black metal. Euronymous and his peers understood that image and reputation were just as important, if not more so, than the actual music. A degree of theatrics is expected at black metal shows. That being said, Mayhem didn't exactly have the budget to do what Iron Maiden do, so they usually just settled for Dead cutting himself and bleeding all over the audience. Welcome to the splash zone. Death metal was, and for the most part still is, brutal music played by normal people. The second wave of black metal was consequently full of fucking lunatics constantly trying to one-up each other in terms of being just as evil as their music sounded. There are obviously the aforementioned suicides, church burnings, and murders, which really helped to establish black metal as this urban legend among music fans, even among people who don't like metal at all. Every fanny you know with an addiction to plaid shirts and death grips knows about Mayhem, even if they refuse to listen to anything heavier than Slipknot. It's a bit of an unconventional and admittedly ill-advised marketing strategy, but it worked. The Norwegian tabloids had a field day with the church burnings and creamed their fucking jeans at the thought of a satanic cult on the loose. Now, with the one exception of Varg Vikernes, who I think is very sincere in his batshit beliefs, I think a lot of the stuff black metal artists say with regards to Satanism is just kayfabe. Kayfabe is wrestling jargon for the fictional world that wrestlers pretend is real. Yeah, wrestling is fake. I'm sure your mind is blown by this revelation. Well, they don't tend to keep it up as much now. It used to be a big deal in wrestling that wrestlers never break kayfabe outside of the ring. When you saw a member of the public, you had to stay in character. Now, no one knows for sure, and there's no solid evidence, but my hot take is that the Satanism in black metal is all just kayfabe and LARPing.
Now that is scientific fact. There's no real evidence for it, but it is scientific fact.
I mean, the founder of the Norwegian scene was a massive fucking LARPing dork, and the guy who killed him wrote his own D&D knockoff. This is very well precedented. I think pretending to be genuinely evil is used as a way to enhance that's their art. Satanism was really just cool symbolism for a general rebellion against organised religion. I mean, if you sincerely believe that Satan is real, you also have to believe in God. Therefore, being an actual Satanist means you accept that there exists an all-powerful being who created everything, and you've declared war on it and sided with the night manager of the afterlife. Good luck with that. That being said, I don't think the Nazis are LARPing. They're pretty sincerely evil shitebags, but I appreciate their honesty about it. So basically, black metal musicians, in my opinion, don't actually worship Satan. I never believe them when they say they do. But that's part of the aesthetic. There's a kind of kayfabe and character and performance art to the whole thing that you just don't get in death metal, or really any other subgenre. This started in the second wave and is very much continued to this day, although the murders and a lot of the other dodgy stuff, far less common now. There's still a lot of dodgy stuff, it still happens, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. But like I've said before, the silent majority of black metal fans aren't like this, and a small benefit of black metal's dodgy history is that a lot of the fan base, not all obviously, have a very nuanced and thoughtful stance when it comes to how to separate the artist from the art. The community is actually better than some people assume. But yeah, there are a lot of dodgy folk, I won't lie, there's a lot of dodginess. Now, there are 3 very different variations of black metal that I missed out, so I'll talk about them now. One very quick and self-explanatory variation that I forgot to mention is melodic black metal. It's exactly what it sounds like, but bizarrely, a lot of people who hate Melodeath really love Dissection. I guess it's because the melodies are just naturally darker for black metal. Also, the vocalist and founder of Dissection, John Nudvide, murdered a man. Because black metal. He claimed that it was part of an occult ritual. Was it? Fuck ya larping fanny. I'm sure it's just a massive coincidence that the victim was a gay guy. Also, he committed suicide in 2006, and in recent years there's a dude online who is convinced that he is John Nudvide reincarnated. Because black metal. And hipsters think it's difficult being a Morrissey fan. And speaking of hipsters... We then have the variation known as black gaze. This is a form of progressive black metal which gets very experimental. The name comes from shoegaze, a slightly derogatory term for pretentious hipster music, and hey, if the shoe fits, gaze at it. It's just as broad a term as progressive, and it seems to cover any black metal that gets particularly experimental. Now, if you combine black metal with other subgenres, like say blackened death metal or blackened thrash, that's not black gaze. Black gaze brings in elements of non-metal music, including folk, indie, alternative rock, or whatever else Anthony Fantano happened to be reviewing when the song was recorded. Black gaze absolutely has many of the essential elements of black metal, while still being decidedly untrue. Most of the time they have very nice production, which is standard in prog, but for black metal it's obviously a major no-no. Sometimes they'll bring in clean singing or entire clean sections, play in the major scale, and generally just throw in a lot of stuff that you would never hear in true Norwegian black metal. Now, this is unsurprising, because it's just what prog bands do, and every other subgenre is used to it. I mean, most death metal fans at the very least respect Opeth, but for whatever reason, a lot of black metal fans fucking hate black gaze, especially Death Heaven. Personally, I don't get it. It's not like there's a shortage of generic black metal out there. Just ignore it if it's not your thing. I've heard the complaint that black gaze shouldn't even be considered black metal because it's too different, and while I think it definitely has its relevance in black metal as a whole, I can sort of agree with this assessment. I primarily consider black gaze to be prog metal rather than black metal. Like, it's both, but I would say it has far more prog to it. This varies from band to band, but even the heaviest black gaze bands outweigh the black with the progginess. But most egregiously of all, there haven't even been any murders in the black gaze scene, nor are there any out and proud Nazis. What a bunch of fucking posers. The most famous, and in some circles infamous, album in black gaze is Deaf Heaven's Sunbather from 2013. It's a perfect case study. Just look at the album cover. A warm pink and orange colour scheme when it's audacious enough having colour at all. Yes, there's screaming over blast beats and distorted guitars, but it's in this uncanny valley where it sounds happy, and the cognitive dissonance of that fries my brain. I don't like it, but I have to admit it's one of the most memorable and interesting albums I've ever heard, for better or worse. The only proggy black metal band that true cultists don't hate is Izan's solo project, since being the frontman of Emperor gives him a free pass to get weird. Other black gaze bands of note include Alcest and Leprous, the latter of which are so prog they sometimes forget to put in any metal at all, let alone black metal. I think the reason these bands are so hated by the black metal community is the same reason any band is hated beyond simply not caring for their music. It seems to come from attracting a demographic that some people don't want to be associated with. In this case, it's hipsters. I personally don't care, and frankly, I'd rather sip manky coffee with a pretentious sociology student than LARP in a snowy forest with some dork who advocates an ideology that, if put into practice, would ban black metal fucking immediately. Anyway, I need a palate cleanser from all this wishy-washy, evolving past metal prog patter. Let's talk about war metal. War metal, also known as bestial black metal, is a mix of black metal and death metal into an utterly devastating combination of relentless brutality. Before explaining war metal, I'll first draw a distinction between it and blackened death metal. Blackened death metal, as the name suggests, is death metal with a strong black metal influence. So it has a lot of the black metal aesthetic and lyricism, but fundamentally it's more like death metal with a focus on speed and brutality rather than atmosphere. I've already mentioned before that some of the bands who fall into this category are derided as Norsecore for their lack of subtlety and atmosphere. The lyrics tend to be edgy for their own sake to the point of inducing cringe, with song titles like Christ Raping Black Metal and God Equals Dog. Damn, Nergal, fucking got him.
I stopped believing in God when I realised it was just dog backwards.
What?
Well, when you think about it, G-O-D-D-O-G. It's like an anagram, but a backwards one, isn't it?
Right.
I like blackened death metal, but I do understand why die-hard black metal fans hate it. I joked around about how it would be ridiculous to see it as an attempt to be more appealing to mainstream audiences, but that's not actually the issue that cultists have with it. It's more to do with the fact that it borrows a lot of the shallow, surface-level elements of black metal, such as buzzsaw guitars, blast beats, and shrieking vocals, without evoking the specific dark atmosphere that makes black metal special. Even though I really like Marduk, I get why some black metal fans don't. I still think they could fall under the broader spectrum of black metal as a primary subgenre, but there's a very obvious contrast between their approach to songwriting and that of Mgwa, for example. Well-known black and death metal bands include the aforementioned Marduk and the bafflingly popular Behemoth. When it comes to the question of whether they count as black metal, I would say yes in a broad sense. They can be thought of as both black metal and death metal, like a dual citizenship or something, squatting right on the border. So, with that said, you can think of war metal as essentially being deathened black metal, which sounds really fucking stupid, so it's called war metal. It's black metal with a strong death metal influence. To be more specific, the black metal sound in question is that of the first wave, Bathory, Hellhammer, and to a lesser extent, Venom. The production is raw and messy, often in a very satisfyingly evil-sounding way. Although I will admit, I'm not a big fan of the sound on Blasphemy's Fallen Angel of Doom when all the sound is only coming from one ear in my headphones. That's just annoying. War metal songs have sections of intense, noisy chaos with endless blast beats and discordant guitar work, combined with clearer sections of simple but effective riffs. The fans often refer to these as caveman riffs because they're highly simplistic and bring out your inner primate. One minute it sounds like Bathory falling down the stairs, and the next it's almost groovy. The vocals are where the death metal influence is clearest, using a low, guttural gurgling style as opposed to the shrieks of regular black metal. There's also the signature move of war metal vocalists, known as the I've often said to those who don't like harsh vocals that they should think of them as a form of percussion rather than melody, and the is a perfect example. This is why it's also sometimes called bestial black metal. It sounds like a monster from Greek mythology has entered the studio. Aesthetically, war metal bands still lean into black metal with chains and spikes galore, but the corpse paint is a unique style. They ditched the white foundation in favour of just the black patterns combined with 6 shades. And while the second wave of black metal was all about high contrast black and white album covers with a picture of a band member in a forest, war metal albums usually have some elaborate illustration of satanic imagery. This almost always involves a goat and or nudity. War metal also gets very progressive and experimental by including a third colour on their album covers. Holy shit! One thing that I really appreciate about war metal is that the fans and the bands don't take themselves nearly as seriously as the pretentious fuds you often find cutting about in regular black metal. Although it would be nice if they could stop patting themselves on the back about how brutal their music is for 5 minutes. We get it, your taste is heavier than most people's. We're all very impressed. Now stop bullying 12-year-olds to the point of suicide for liking Slipknot, you fucking weapon. I've heard that apparently a very small minority of fans insist that war metal and bestial black metal are different subgenres, but I don't buy it. Every significant band from this scene gets frequently labelled as both. Now, I could be wrong on that, so let me know, but you'll need a pretty compelling case with clear examples of where you can articulate the differences. I never mentioned this subgenre before because I didn't even realise it existed until after I'd made the first 5 parts of this series. It's very niche, but I have to say, when I'm in the right mood for it, it's really good. I'll admit, I started listening to war metal ironically because it was so comically over the top, but before long I started thinking, wait a minute, oh, this is actually pretty good. Oh no. Blasphemy are probably the best known war metal band, and they were really the pioneers of the sound and aesthetic. They inspired countless bands who heard Blasphemy sounding like Bathory falling down the stairs and said, awesome, we're gonna sound like Blasphemy falling down the stairs. Other war metal bands include Revenge, Archgoat, Conqueror, Beherit, Goat Penis, Caveman Cult, and Sabaton. Nah, I'm just fucking with you. Sabaton are power metal, as I've established, but some people hear the term war metal and understandably assume it's another joke subgenre based on lyrics, and if that were the case, Sabaton would naturally fit in that category. They don't though. They really don't. This is very different. And with that, I think we'll end part 7 here. Join me again for part 8, in which we'll revisit metalcore.